Hi, this is an excerpt of a live webinar that was filmed on the 6th of June 2023. Therefore, the contents of this video are applicable from that date, and of course things may well have changed since then. This section is the third part in the series and deals with higher risk buildings and the building safety regulator and the new regulatory system for those buildings. What I'm going to talk about now is the new regime for higher risk buildings. And that new regime will start October this year. And the transitional arrangements is if there is an existing application made to a building control body, so either the local authority or an approved inspector like ourselves, that will remain under our control, providing work has substantially started before April next year. So there is that 6-month transition between the two, and that is very, very important. And a key point here is that description of what commencement is. And as Joe mentioned earlier, that is works up to DPC stage, so to sort of ground floor slab stage, as a full commencement of works. Anything that doesn't meet those transitional requirements will automatically go back, well not go back, but will go over to the new building safety regulator and be dealt with under the new regime. So that's a very important starting point. So design and construction of building regulation stage of buildings. And I think just a little bit of a framework here to give a bit of clarity, because I understand that me and Joe are probably sometimes going off at tangents and talking mumbo jumbo, but the clarity of the situation is this. There is the building control authorities. So these are the people that can enforce the acts and the regulations legally and carry out prosecution for non-compliance or non-meeting of the regulations themselves, would be the building safety regulator for higher risk buildings or the local authority for non-higher risk buildings. And then the building control bodies, what I'm talking about now for higher risk buildings would be the building safety regulator, and then for non-high risk buildings would either be the local authority or of course our good selves as a building control approver. And then the restricted activities and functions are applicable to all of those. So plan certificates, final certificates, inspection of work can only be carried out by a registered building inspector that can work for these building control bodies. So implementing the new building control regime. So this consultation is actually closed, but it's just quite a nice slide that we've stolen. So it's really implementing a much more rigorous regime for these higher risk buildings. And I'll just clarify again, I know Joe has mentioned it previously, high risk buildings are those buildings 18 metres or more to finished floor level, are residential sleeping accommodation, either flats or student accommodation, potentially hospitals, or even school accommodation that are permanent residences. So sleeping accommodation over 18 metres, this does not apply to hotels. So this is a whole new regime, and there are lots of facets to it, which I will go through today, some in more detail than others. So as Joe has mentioned, the new duty holders are certainly in place for the new regime. Hard stops or gateways, which I will go through in detail as the process of gaining that approval. Change control processes for higher risk buildings. Mandatory occurrence reporting and the famous golden thread of information, and the wider context of competence and record keeping. So, same slide, and that's deliberate because the roles and responsibilities are the same, if not that there's going to be a lot more work to do for these duty holders on the higher risk buildings. And that is referred to throughout the processes that are put in place through the BSR application routes. So I'm not going to go through these in detail now, but I will refer to them as we go through the process for applications for high risk buildings. And again, those competency requirements, and I think my only comment here is just about the threshold of competence. So what competence looks like for a structural engineer designing a small single beam on a rear extension, and what it looks like for an engineering company and those working in that engineering company for a 30-metre tower block are, of course, completely different. But the framework of competence applies to everyone, but demonstrating that threshold of competence is going to be incredibly important for those involved in higher risk buildings. And that includes us as building inspectors. It's a higher grade of a registered building inspector that will be able to work on these projects. Okay, so this is a completely new way of working. This is the building control application process for higher risk buildings. And I appreciate this is a little difficult to pick up on the slides, but it's essentially a series of gateways, hard stops as the regulator likes to use. And these gateways allow the process to move on to the next phase. Gateway 1 is actually at planning stage. And this is where, at planning submission stage to the local authority planning department, a consultation will be carried out to the BSR to review the fire strategy, the outline fire strategy from the fire safety statement. So the broad brush fire safety statement and fire strategy is approved even at Gateway 1 for planning permission. And planning permission will only be granted once the BSR has had an opportunity to comment and recommend that they're happy with the proposals at this early stage. And that's a welcome change to the industry and should make things easier for when we get to the all-important Gateway 2 stage. So Gateway 2 is essentially that sort of full plans building control application. And I'll talk about this in quite a bit of detail, but it's important to note at this stage, the duty holders are notified to the BSR with accompanying statements. And at this stage, the building safety regulator seeks guidance and advice from a registered building inspector at level 3 competence level. And that work cannot start on site until the Gateway 2 application has been approved. We then move through to Gateway 3, which is the construction phase, which will be used to building control inspecting and checking the works in progress. And that will be carried out throughout the project. But the key change here is at the end of Gateway 3 is the issuing of the building certificate has to be issued before the building can be occupied. So I'll talk about those two gateways in a little bit of detail now. So Gateway 2, this really is REBA stage 4. This is the main design has been completed and we're ready to submit that to the building safety regulator. And this must be done before work starts on site. So any work on site. So demolition and strip out could be carried out, but actual construction cannot start until this stage has been approved. And at this point, the submission of a whole host of information, which I'll go through in a little bit of detail in a minute, is submitted to the BSR, who will then convene a multidisciplinary team, including fire engineers, structural engineers, health and safety, fire and rescue representative, sewage undertaker, and of course a registered building inspector to do a full design review of that project and issue approval. It's important to note the building safety regulator has 12 weeks to do this. So a very key takeaway for high risk buildings is the design phase must be preloaded to allow for this time period. Once the application is approved, you can then move forward to the construction phase. So, deliberately so, this is a rather unreadable, lengthy slide, and that's because Gateway 2 application is a big application. There's going to be a lot of documentation. There's a list of prescribed documents that must be submitted, a list of statements, and this is something completely new again, statements from client, principal designer, principal contractor about how the building meets the regulations, how they think it meets the regulations, and what the process will be to ensure it meets the regulations. And they're quite important statements from those duty holders, which of course will be able to be held to account. And then on top of that, we've got that full design package of information, REBA stage 4, full design approval. Those of you who've been in the industry long enough will remember section 20 for tall buildings, and also full plan certificates that were made to the local authority. It's that level of information and probably some more. I was on a call with the BSR Gateway 2 team a couple of weeks ago, and they gave a bit of clarity about this process, which is still being confirmed through the working groups. But they do understand that, you know, with designing and building a complex building, there will be certain sections of that building that will be at performance specification stage only. So, for example, the sprinkler system to BS 9251, performance specification at Gateway 2 stage, would then require a further submission of the detailed design on that, which allows you to get approval at Gateway 2, but with conditions on further applications to be made. But the important thing to be noted, they made it clear that work cannot work on any phase of works until it's got that Gateway 2 approval. So works on that sprinkler system would not be able to commence until the regulator has had time to review and approve that package of information. So really looking at front loading as much design work as possible to get through this Gateway 2 application stage. The construction phase, this is the exciting bit for us building inspectors. We love getting muddy boots. And this is site inspection from the way that it's always been carried out, but it's also going to be a little bit different. I think a lot more time will be spent on site, probably less regularly. And a big focus will be reviewing how the duty holders themselves are regulating their own work, their internal QA processes, their own internal monitoring processes. Are they following their inspection schedule? Are they communicating with the BSR? Are they keeping appropriate records? Are they supervising the work in the correct way? Is there a system of quality assurance in place? And all of this will be reviewed at key stages of the process. But it also introduces a new thing of change control processes for both major and notifiable change control. And I'll talk about this in a little bit of detail. But again, it's worth noting that 6 weeks is required for a major change to be approved by the regulator, and works cannot start on that change until that has been approved by them. So mandatory occurrence reporting as part of the construction phase is a completely new thing in building control, but mirrors, as Joe mentioned earlier, mirrors that CDM flavour to this whole process. And that is if there has been a risk on site identified, so for example, a subcontractor has been identified by the site management team of installing incorrect fire rated material into the building fabric, that's been addressed, they've been stopped, the correct installation has now been put in, there's a duty to report that. And that is really to kind of create this culture of responsibility and drive intelligence-led enforcement by the BSR themselves. So it's completely new, and mandatory occurrence reporting mechanisms are expected to be in place, a bit like a whistleblowing process for the contractors and the design teams throughout the construction phase. And change control. This is what I was referring to earlier, and record keeping of the change control. Very, very important. So changing a design, changing a material, keeping of records for that change is incredibly important. So there's full traceability that can be used throughout the life cycle of the building, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in the golden thread. But meticulous record keeping throughout the process is absolutely crucial in this process. So record keeping and notification for major and notifiable changes. And this is really, really important. So there's some examples on this slide of major changes and notifiable changes. So a major change could be a change in the building design itself. a change in the means of escape strategy. And a good example of this is potentially the change of a product affecting fire classification. So for example, a fire rated product that at design stage was A2 rated is now being substituted, possibly with good reason, for a product of a B rating. That is considered a major change, which will need a full application to the BSR for a 6-week approval before that change can be made. A notifiable change is something a little bit more minor and is a more, for example, substituting a like for like. So you've got an A2 rated product and you're substituting it for another A2 rated product. You would have to notify that change, but it is a much more faster system for approval. But this is a big thing for construction. Construction of buildings, as you guys all know, changes rapidly. For bigger buildings, that process is going to be a lot more robust and it's going to have to slow down. So this is a really important change for buildings over 18 metres. The golden thread of information, this is actually quite a fashionable bit of the whole process, and it has been quite widely talked about, and there's lots of tech companies that are designing software for the golden thread, and there's lots of seminars out there actually on the golden thread. But the take home on golden thread of information really is from concept to design right the way through to a building that's fully occupied and operating, is the collection of information, the updating of information to do with the critical life safety elements of that building has to be kept. The encouragement of using BIM and other modelling software, record keeping of maintenance strategies, change control plans, management control when buildings are occupied, but also all of the construction phase information is absolutely critical. And this is going to be a huge thing, as when you get to a building safety case review, which Joe's going to talk about shortly, this is going to form the basis of that safety case review for buildings that have recently been built. So, I think that's enough on golden thread, because there is quite a lot out there on golden thread of information. Gateway 3. So we've been through our Gateway 2. We're at the end of our Gateway 3 now, the end of the construction phase. And just like we always have done in building control, it requires a completion inspection and the submission of information. But we're now at a hard stop point. And again, this is new legislation. You cannot occupy a HRB without the issuing of a certificate from the Building Safety Regulator. And that requires the full submission of information and a completion inspection by the BSR to satisfy themselves that they are happy, that the principal designer, the principal contractor and the client are satisfied that the building meets the threshold of building regulations compliance. There is still the opportunity for partial completions of phases of work, but that has to be in a much more robust and planned way. Much more, we are going to be handing over Block B in 6 months' time, notifying the regulator of that, and the process of going through, signing that off is agreed by both parties. And I'm just going to pick up on that on the next slide. So Gateway 3 application, again, a monster of slides with lots of words on. Prescribed documents are in there, golden thread statements in there, descriptions, contact information. This standard information that you've seen throughout the process is needed to be updated and resubmitted, but along with all the background information to give evidence as to why this project is okay for building regulations approval. And that could be an enormous amount of O&M information that you're used to doing, but also QA records, as-built information, certification, commissioning information, and internal reporting, as well as all of these prescribed documents. And the big take home here is there is a 12-week period for the Building Safety Regulator to review and approve that information. So for a tall building, it could be fully completed and will remain unoccupied until the regulator is in a position to issue that certificate, for which it has 12 weeks. There's a big change for the industry of these bigger buildings. So that's the construction phase and the design phase for HRBs. But the Act also applies to buildings and occupation. So I'm going to hand you back to Joe, who's going to briefly, and I do use the word briefly, Joe, briefly talk about buildings in occupation that are classed as HRBs.
Thank you very much, Andy. You did say briefly. The first thing I'm going to do is just touch on something which you were talking about just now about these hard stops for before you start on site, before you occupy, and that 12-week period. Those are hard stops which are in legislation, and it's a criminal offence if you ignore them. So if you don't get the building safety regulator's approval and then you start on site, criminal offence. Penalties could be unlimited fines up to 6 months in prison. Same with if you occupy within that 12-week period. If you occupy the building before you get the occupation certificate, again, criminal offence. It could be unlimited fines and up to 6 months in prison. And that 6 months in prison is down to the duty holder, which would generally be the client. So again, it's really important that you take that on board. It's quite serious stuff, and this is where the duty holder being an identified or nominated person really comes into its own, because ultimately, their name is on the piece of paper, they're the duty holder, they take the responsibility. So that's where this is all coming from. Anyway, in occupation, for high risk buildings in occupation, there is going to be a new process under the Building Safety Act, and I'm just going to